The second time Marcus stood up at my cousin's wedding to say the thing he'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks, I was in the back row of the Edenbrook Country Club ballroom with my hand on the armrest of a chair I'd chosen, specifically because it was 12 feet from the nearest exit and 3 feet from the woman who was recording everything on her phone. And I was wearing a dress the color of old brick, and I was not going to cry. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why would someone go to a wedding where they know they're going to be humiliated? The answer is that the first time I didn't know. The first time I walked in wearing an ivory dress because Delia, my cousin, the bride, had asked me to wear ivory because her color scheme was ivory and sage, and she said I'd look beautiful. And I believed her because she was my cousin and because I was 32 and recently divorced, and I was the kind of person who still believed that family meant what it was supposed to mean. The second time, I walked in wearing brick red because I'd chosen it, and I sat in the back because I'd chosen that too. And the woman with the phone was a court-appointed social worker named Grace Okonkwo, whose business card I'd been carrying in my clutch for 19 days. And nothing Marcus was about to say was going to surprise me because I'd already heard it. I'd already heard it, and I'd already died because of it. And I was here to make sure that the only person who walked out of that ballroom destroyed was the one who'd planned it. If you're new here, welcome to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. I need to tell you about the first time. The time that ended with me at the bottom of a staircase with the back of my skull cracked open on the landing. Marcus and I met when I was 24. He was 27. He worked at his family's company, Halloway & Sons Construction, which his father had built from a 2-man operation into a 42-person firm that handled commercial builds across the county. Marcus was the vice president of operations, which sounded impressive, and meant he signed purchase orders and managed vendor contracts and sat in an office on the second floor of a cinderblock building on Mill Street with a view of the equipment yard. He was funny. He remembered details. On our third date, he noticed I'd mentioned my mother's geraniums twice, and he showed up the next Saturday with a flat of red geraniums and said, "Tell your mom these are the drought-resistant kind. She won't have to water them every day." My mother looked at me over the geraniums and said, "This one pays attention, Claire. I married him 14 months later. The wedding was small. Delia was my maid of honor. She'd been my cousin and my closest friend since we were 6. The kind of friend who knows where all your cracks are because she was there when most of them happened." Lily was born when I was 28, 6 pounds, 11 ounces. She had Marcus's dark hair and my hands, small, square-fingered, the kind of hands that grab things and don't let go. The first time I held her, she grabbed my index finger, and the grip was so strong and so certain that I laughed. And Marcus laughed, and the nurse said, "She's got a hold on you, Mama." And I said, "Yes, she does." And I meant it in a way I didn't fully understand yet, a way that would matter more than I knew. The marriage started to crack in year 4, not dramatically. The way a foundation cracks, slowly, invisibly, in the places you can't see. Marcus traveled more, he worked later. He started keeping a second phone, which he said was for work, for vendors who needed to reach him after hours. I didn't question it. I was teaching full-time, 4th grade at Pinewood Elementary, and raising Lily and grading papers at 10 p.m. and making lunches at 6 a.m., and I was tired in the way that mothers are tired. The kind of tired where your body keeps moving, but your mind starts to blur at the edges. And I didn't have the energy to notice that Marcus's work phone buzzed at 11:30 p.m. on nights he said he was home, or that the hotel receipts he left in his jacket pockets were for rooms with 1 bed in towns he'd supposedly visited for one-day meetings, or that the vendor invoices piling up on his desk were from companies I'd never heard of. Meridian Supply Company, Lakeside Materials Group, Allegheny Fasteners, with addresses I later learned were P.O. boxes in a strip mall in Westbrook. I found out about the affair the way you find out about most affairs, by accident. I was looking for a receipt for Lily's pediatrician in Marcus's jacket because he'd said he'd paid the copay, and I needed it for the flexible spending account. And instead of a receipt, I found a folded note in handwriting that wasn't mine. It said, "Thursday, same room. Don't be late this time. N." The note smelled like gardenias. I stood in the hallway with the jacket in my hands and the note between my fingers, and I could feel the paper, soft, like it had been handled and refolded many times, and I could smell the gardenias. Sweet, heavy, the kind of smell that sticks to fabric. And I thought, I know that smell. I know it from somewhere. And then I realized Nadine Whitmer. She worked in accounts payable at Halloway & Sons. She'd been to our house for the company Christmas party. She'd brought a bottle of wine and complimented the kitchen and held Lily and said, "She's gorgeous, Claire. You're so lucky." And I'd said, "Thank you." And the whole time she'd been sleeping with my husband, and she smelled like gardenias, and I hadn't known, or I'd known and hadn't let myself know, because knowing would have required doing something, and I was too tired to do something. I filed for divorce in March. Marcus didn't contest it. He was calm about it in a way that should have warned me. The same calm I'd seen in his face when he talked about vendor contracts, the same calm I'd seen when he'd signed the mortgage refinance 2 years earlier without reading past the first page. He said he wanted what was best for Lily. He said he wanted joint custody. He said he wanted to make this easy, Claire, for everyone. His lawyer drafted a custody agreement that looked standard, 50-50, 1 week on, 1 week off. I signed it because my lawyer said it was fair, and because I wanted it to be over, and because I was still the kind of person who believed that Marcus, even as an ex-husband, meant what he said. He didn't mean what he said. The custody arrangement was a setup. He wanted Lily full-time. Not because he loved her more. I don't think he loved her more. I don't think he loved her the way I loved her. The way that makes you check her breathing at night and memorize the weight of her in your arms. But because Lily was leverage. Lily was the thing he could use to hurt me. The way you use a pressure point. The way you find the softest part and press until the person goes where you want. I didn't understand that yet. I would understand it at the bottom of a staircase. The first incident was in April. Marcus picked Lily up for his week and brought her back 3 hours late. He said there was traffic. The second time, he was 6 hours late. He said Lily had fallen asleep and he didn't want to wake her. The third time, he didn't bring her back at all. He called and said Lily was upset and she wanted to stay with him, and he thought it was best if she stayed, just for a few extra days. I drove to his apartment at 10 p.m., and the lights were on, and I could see Lily's silhouette in the window, and I knocked, and Marcus answered, and he said, "She's sleeping, Claire, you'll upset her," and he closed the door. I stood on the doorstep, and I could hear Lily through the door. She wasn't sleeping, she was watching cartoons, I could hear the TV, and I couldn't get to her because the door was closed, and the custody agreement said he had her this week. And there was nothing I could do at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. I called my lawyer. She said, document everything. She said, file a motion for contempt if he violates the schedule again. She said the court takes custody violations seriously. I documented. I filed. The court date was set for June 12th. And then Delia called and said she was getting married on June 8th, 4 days before the court date at Edenbrook Country Club, and she wanted me there, and she said Marcus was invited too because he was friends with the groom. The groom, Tom, was a guy Marcus had gone to college with. And she said, "Please, Claire, please come. I know it's awkward, but you're my cousin, and I want you there." I should have said no. I should have said I can't be in the same room as Marcus 4 days before a custody hearing. I said yes because she was my cousin, and because I was still the kind of person who said yes when family asked, and because I thought I could handle it. I thought I could sit through a wedding with my ex-husband in the room and not fall apart. I was wrong. June 8th, the wedding, Edenbrook Country Club. The ballroom smelled like gardenias, Delia's wedding flowers, white gardenias and sage, the same gardenias that smelled like Nadine, the same smell I'd found in Marcus's jacket. And the room was warm and full of people, and the string quartet was playing something I didn't recognize, and I was wearing the ivory dress because Delia had asked. And my hands were shaking, and I didn't know why my hands were shaking. I thought it was the divorce. I thought it was seeing Marcus. I thought it was the gardenias. I didn't know yet that my hands were shaking because my body knew something my brain hadn't caught up to, that this was a setup, that Marcus had planned this the way he planned vendor contracts, carefully and with documentation, and that the wedding was not a wedding for him. It was a stage. The toast happened at 8:45 p.m. Tom's best man gave a speech, then Delia's father. Then, unexpectedly, Marcus stood up. He wasn't on the program. He had a glass of champagne. He tapped it with a fork. The room went quiet. I was at table 9 near the back, and I watched him stand, and I felt something in my stomach drop, the way your stomach drops when you miss a step, and I didn't know what was coming, but my body knew. My hands went cold. The gardenia smell was thick. Marcus said, "I want to say something about family." He said family is the most important thing. He said he'd learned that the hard way. He said his ex-wife, and he looked at me, directly at me, and the whole room followed his eyes. His ex-wife had been struggling. He said she'd been unstable. He said she'd been having emotional outbursts. He said he was worried about their daughter. He said he'd been trying to get Claire help, but she'd refused. He said he was asking the family tonight, as a family, to support Claire because she needed support, and to support him because he was trying to protect Lily. He said it in a voice that was calm and concerned and generous, the voice of a man who was worried about his ex-wife, the voice of a man who was doing the right thing, and every person in that room looked at me with pity, and I could feel the pity on my skin like a rash, and I could smell the gardenias, and my hands were shaking, and I stood up, and I said, "That's not true." My voice cracked. It cracked the way voices crack when you're trying to speak through a closed throat, and it sounded, to the room, to every person in the room, like the voice of a woman who was unstable, who was having an emotional outburst, who needed help. Marcus had recorded the whole thing. I found out later, much later after the custody hearing, after everything, that he'd had his friend Tom record it from the best man's table. The video showed a woman in an ivory dress standing up at a wedding with her voice cracking, surrounded by gardenias, looking exactly like the kind of person Marcus had described. Unstable, emotional, unfit. I left the wedding. I drove home. I sat in the driveway of the house on Maple Court, the house I'd kept in the divorce, the house with the geraniums my mother still watered, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and I shook, not crying, shaking. The kind of shaking where your whole body vibrates and your teeth chatter and you can't stop it. And you don't know if it's anger or fear or grief or all three. The steering wheel was cool against my forehead. I could smell the gardenias on my dress. I couldn't get the smell off. The custody hearing was June 12th. Marcus's lawyer presented the video. My lawyer objected. The judge watched it. My lawyer said it was edited, it was misleading, it was a setup. The judge said the court's primary concern was the best interests of the child, and the behavior exhibited in the video was concerning. Marcus's lawyer presented character witnesses, people from the wedding, people who'd seen me stand up and crack. They said I'd seemed agitated. They said I had seemed unstable. They said they were worried about Lily. Marcus's lawyer also presented a document, a letter, supposedly from my therapist, stating that I'd been treated for anxiety and depression and that my condition could affect my parenting. The letter was forged. I'd never been to that therapist. The signature wasn't mine. It wasn't even the therapist's, I found out later, because the therapist whose letterhead was used had retired 2 years ago. But the letter looked real, and the video looked real, and the witnesses sounded real, and the judge, a man named Harrison who had 38 cases on his docket that morning, and approximately 4 minutes to decide each one, granted Marcus primary physical custody. I got every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. My daughter, who was 6, who grabbed my finger and didn't let go, was taken from me on a Tuesday afternoon by a man who'd rehearsed a wedding toast for 3 weeks. I didn't see that coming. I didn't see any of it coming, but the worst part, the part I need to tell you about, the part that ended with the staircase, was what came after. Lily stopped recognizing me, not right away, but by August, when I picked her up for my Wednesday dinner, she was quiet. She didn't run to me. She walked to the car with her backpack on and her head down, and Marcus stood in the doorway and watched, and his face had that calm, that same calm from the wedding. And I buckled Lily in, and I said, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" And she said, "Daddy says you're sick." She said, "Daddy says you need medicine." She said, "Daddy says I have to live with him because you can't take care of me." She was 6. She said it the way a 6-year-old says things, plainly, without malice, repeating what she'd been told. And I gripped the steering wheel, and I didn't cry because I was driving, and because if I cried, she'd think something was wrong, and I didn't want her to think something was wrong, because Marcus would use that too. I started investigating. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew that Marcus had planned the wedding humiliation, that the custody case had been built on fabricated evidence, and that there had to be more. There was always more with people like Marcus. The vendor invoices? I went back to the invoices, Meridian Supply, Lakeside Materials, Allegheny Fasteners, and I searched the addresses. All 3 were P.O. boxes at a mail depot in Westbrook. I searched the company registrations. All 3 were registered to the same person, Nadine Whitmer. Marcus had been routing fake purchase orders through shell companies controlled by his girlfriend and pocketing the payments. Over 2 years, he'd funneled $312,000 from Holloway & Sons into accounts he and Nadine controlled. He was embezzling from his own family's company and using the money to, what? To fund the divorce, to fund the lawyer, to fund the custody case, to fund the life he was building with Nadine while he dismantled the life he'd built with me. I called his father, Robert Holloway. I told him about the invoices. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I have the registrations, I have the addresses, I have the names." He said, "I'll look into it." He called me back 3 days later, and his voice was different. Smaller, older, the voice of a man who'd just been shown the shape of what his son had done. And he said, "You're right." He said the forensic accountant confirmed it. $312,000 over 26 months. He said Marcus was going to be removed from the company. He said there would be legal action. He said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I'm sorry about Lily. I was going to use it. The embezzlement. I was going to file a motion to reconsider custody based on new evidence. Marcus was a felon. He was under investigation. He was about to be charged." I called my lawyer on a Thursday afternoon. I said, "I have proof he's embezzling." I said, "I have proof the therapist letter was forged." I said, "I have proof the wedding was a setup." She said, "Bring everything to the office on Friday. We'll file Monday, Friday night, October 17th. Marcus came to the house on Maple Court. He said he wanted to talk. He said he wanted to discuss co-parenting. He said he wanted to make things right. He brought a bottle of wine, a Pinot Noir, the kind we used to drink before Lily was born, and he poured 2 glasses, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he said, "I know about the invoices, Claire." He said, "My father told me." He said, "You need to understand that I did it for us." I said, "There is no us." He said, "There's always been an us. There's Lily. There's always going to be Lily." He said, "If you go to the court, if you tell them about the invoices, I lose everything." I said, "You should have thought about that before you stole from your family." He said, "You should have thought about that before you took Lily from me." He stood up. He was between me and the door. The kitchen was small. The table was between us. He said, "Don't do it, Claire. Don't file." I said, "I'm filing Monday." He said, "Please." I said, "No." He didn't hit me. He didn't need to. The back stairs, the ones off the kitchen, the narrow wooden ones that led to the basement, the light at the top had been flickering for a week. I'd been meaning to change the bulb. I hadn't changed the bulb. He knew I hadn't changed the bulb. I turned to go up the front stairs to get away from him, to get to my phone, and he moved, and I moved, and my foot caught the top step of the back stairs. And the light was off. He'd turned it off, I realized later. He'd unscrewed the bulb on his way in. He'd planned this, the way he planned everything. And I fell. I fell the way you fall when there's nothing to catch. The stairs were steep and narrow and unlit, and I hit the 4th step, then the 8th, then the landing. The back of my head hit the concrete. The sound was, I can't describe the sound. It was the sound of something final. The pain was white, not sharp, white, like looking into the sun with your eyes closed. Marcus came down the stairs. He stood over me. He didn't call 911. He didn't kneel down. He took my phone off the table where I'd left it. He took the wine glass I'd been holding. I hadn't drunk any. I hadn't touched it. But he poured the rest of the bottle on the floor and spread it near the base of the stairs. And he set my glass on the 3rd step where it could have fallen from my hand. He went back upstairs. He closed the kitchen door. I heard the lock turn, the lock I'd never used because it was the back stairs, and who locks their back stairs? And I heard his footsteps on the kitchen tile getting fainter, and I heard the front door open and close. I lay on the basement landing, and I could feel the blood, warm, then cooling, and I could smell the wine, sharp and fruity, mixing with the concrete dust, and I could feel the cold coming up through the floor and into my spine, and I thought, Lily, I thought, she's at Marcus's apartment. I thought, she's waiting for me to pick her up tomorrow for our Wednesday dinner. And I'm not going to come, and she's going to think I didn't want to come, and she's going to grow up thinking her mother didn't want her. And Marcus is going to tell her that. Marcus is going to tell her every week for the rest of her life that her mother was unstable and left, and no one is going to tell her the truth. I thought about her hand on my finger, the grip, the certainty. I thought, she grabbed me like she meant it, and I am dying on a basement floor because I said no to the wrong man. The last thing I felt was the cold. The last thing I thought was the bulb. I should have changed the bulb. I woke up on the kitchen floor, not the basement, the kitchen. The tile under my cheek was warm. The sun came through the window above the sink at the afternoon angle, the angle that made the geraniums on the windowsill glow, and the house smelled like coffee, the dark roast I brewed every morning, and I could hear the refrigerator humming, and I could hear a car pass on Maple Court, and I could hear Lily's cartoon playing in the living room, and I pressed my hand flat against the tile, and it was warm and smooth, and I was breathing. My phone was on the counter. I reached for it. The screen said May 19th. 3:47 p.m. 20 days before the wedding, 20 days before the toast, 20 days before the custody hearing, 20 days before the staircase. I lay there for a long time. Lily was in the living room. I could hear the cartoon, some show with a talking dog, the same show she watched every afternoon at 3:30. She was alive. She was here. She was 10 feet away, and she was alive, and she was mine, and it was May 19th, and I had 20 days. I pressed my face into the tile, and I breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth, and the tile smelled like lemon cleaner and warm grout, and I cried. The quiet kind, the kind where your body lets go because it finally can. I cried until the tile was wet, and then I stopped, and I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and I stood up and I went into the living room, and Lily was on the couch with her backpack still on. She'd just gotten home from school. And she looked up and said, "Mommy, are you okay?" And I said, "I'm okay, baby." And I sat down next to her, and she leaned into me, and I put my arm around her, and I could feel the weight of her, the specific weight of a 6-year-old who leans into you because she trusts you completely. And I held her, and I didn't let go for a long time. I made a list, not a plan, a list. The way you make a list when you've been given 20 days, and the way you know the stove is hot, that you will not get another 20. Number 1, the wedding. Marcus was going to stand up at Delia's wedding on June 8th and deliver a rehearsed speech, designed to make me look unstable in front of every member of my family. I needed to be there. I needed to not crack. I needed to record him. I needed witnesses who were on my side, not his. Number 2, the custody hearing. June 12th, Marcus was going to present the wedding video and a forged therapist letter. I needed a lawyer who understood what was happening before it happened. I needed to preempt the evidence. I needed to show the court that the video was a setup, that the letter was a forgery, and that Marcus had a pattern of manipulation. Number 3, the embezzlement. $312,000 through 3 shell companies controlled by Nadine Whitmer. Robert Holloway didn't know about it yet. He wouldn't find out until I told him. And in the first life, I didn't tell him until October. In this life, I was telling him now. In this life, the embezzlement was going to be exposed before the custody hearing, not after. Number 4, the staircase, the bulb, the back door lock. I needed to change the bulb. I needed to install a lock Marcus couldn't open. I needed to never let him stand between me and the only exit. Number 5, Marcus. I needed to let him think nothing had changed. I needed to let him believe I was still the person who said yes, who didn't fight, who cracked under pressure. I needed to let him rehearse his speech and deliver it, because a speech delivered in front of 140 witnesses is evidence, and evidence is what destroys the person who presents it. I called Elise Marquette the next morning. She was a family law attorney in private practice on Clifton Avenue, not the lawyer I'd used in the first life, the one who'd said the custody agreement was fair, the one who'd been outmaneuvered by Marcus's lawyer at every turn. Elise Marquette was different. In the first life, a woman at Lily's school had mentioned her, said she was the lawyer you called when your ex was playing games, said she was expensive and worth it, said she'd once gotten a father's custody revoked because he'd coached the child to lie, and Elise had proved it with 3 weeks of school pickup recordings. I hadn't called her in the first life. I'd been too busy, too tired, too certain that the system would work if I just told the truth. I called her now. Elise was 44, with short gray hair and a voice like a closed door. Her office was on the 2nd floor above a bookstore, and it smelled like old paper and the cedar of the bookshelves she'd built herself. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk, and I told her everything. The affair, the divorce, the custody violations, the upcoming wedding, what Marcus was going to do. Not what I feared he might do, what he was going to do, because I'd seen it, because I'd lived it, because I'd died because of it. I didn't tell her I'd died. I told her I'd seen the pattern. I told her Marcus rehearsed his public performances. I told her he was going to use the wedding to manufacture evidence. I told her about the therapist letter, not yet forged, but coming, because Marcus had used it in the first life and he would use it again because it had worked. I told her about the embezzlement. I told her about Nadine. I told her about the shell companies and the P.O. boxes and the $312,000. Elise listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. She took notes in a leather journal with a fountain pen that scratched the paper. When I finished, she set the pen down and said, "The custody agreement is already signed." I said yes. She said, "We can petition to modify based on a material change in circumstances." I said, "What counts?" She said, "A parent committing a felony counts, a parent coaching a child counts, a parent manufacturing evidence counts." She said, "But we need proof, not predictions." I said, "I know. I have 19 days." She said, "Then let's use them." The next day, I went to the mail depot in Westbrook. I asked the woman behind the counter, a heavyset woman named Darlene with reading glasses on a beaded chain, about the P.O. boxes registered to Meridian Supply, Lakeside Materials, and Allegheny Fasteners. She said she couldn't give me information about box holders. I said I understood. I bought a shipping label and mailed a letter to Meridian Supply at the P.O. box address, a letter requesting a product catalog, and when it was returned 3 days later with "No such business at this address" stamped on the front, I had the first piece. I then called the county clerk's office and requested the business registration filings for all 3 companies. The filings listed Nadine Whitmer as the registered agent for all 3. The filings were public record. I photographed every page. I drove to Halloway & Sons on Mill Street on May 24th. Robert Halloway was in his office on the 2nd floor. He was 67, with hands like shovels and a face that looked like it had been left in the sun. I sat across from him and I set the business registrations on his desk. Meridian Supply, Lakeside Materials, Allegheny Fasteners, all registered to Nadine Whitmer, and I set the returned letter on top and I said, "Your son has been routing fake purchase orders through shell companies controlled by his girlfriend and pocketing the payments. $312,000 over 26 months. Robert looked at the papers. He picked up the registrations. He read them slowly the way a man reads something he doesn't want to be true. He set them down. He said, "How did you find this?" I said, "I looked." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because he took my daughter and I wanted to know what he was hiding." Robert called his forensic accountant that afternoon. The accountant confirmed everything within 4 days. The purchase orders were fabricated. The materials listed on the invoices had never been ordered. The quantities didn't match any project, and the payments had been routed to accounts at Meridian Trust controlled by Nadine Whitmer. The total was $312,847 over 26 months. Robert was sitting at his desk when the accountant finished, and his face did something I recognized. The same face Marcus made when he heard a number he didn't like, the tightening of the jaw, the recalibration behind the eyes, and then the face collapsed, and Robert Halloway, who had built a 42-person company from nothing, put his head in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. I sat in the chair across from him, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He'd raised a son who stole from him and used the money to destroy a family, and there was nothing I could say that would make that smaller. Robert filed a police report on May 30th. He filed a civil suit against Marcus and Nadine on June 1st. He removed Marcus from the company the same day. The board, which consisted of Robert and his 2 brothers, voted unanimously to terminate Marcus's employment and pursue criminal charges. Marcus was served at his apartment on June 2nd. He called me that night. His voice was calm. He said, "What did you do, Claire?" I said I told the truth. He said, "You shouldn't have done that." I said, "You shouldn't have stolen $300,000 from your father." He was quiet. I could hear the television in the background, some sports broadcast, the crowd noise, the announcer's voice rising and falling, and I could hear him breathing. And the breathing was the same rhythm as the breathing I'd heard at the top of the stairs. And I said, "Marcus?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Don't come to my house." He said, "I wasn't planning on it." I said, "I mean it." He said, "I heard you." I hung up. I called Elise. I said, "He called." She said, "Did he threaten you?" I said, "Not in words." She said, "Document the call." I said, "I just did." She said, "Change your locks." I said, "I'm doing it tonight." I went to the hardware store on Clifton Avenue and I bought a deadbolt. Brass. Heavy. The kind that needs a key from both sides. I installed it on the back door myself, the door to the back stairs, the narrow wooden stairs that led to the basement. I changed the bulb in the stairwell. I screwed it in tight. I stood at the top of the stairs and I looked down into the lit stairwell and I thought about the dark. I thought about how the dark had been a tool, the way the gardenias had been a tool, the way the ivory dress had been a tool, the way everything Marcus had ever given me or done for me had been a tool shaped like kindness. I turned on the light and left it on, and I went to bed, and I locked the deadbolt, and I put the key under my pillow, and I slept. The social worker's name was Grace Okonkwo. Elise had requested a court-appointed custody evaluation on May 22nd, citing a pattern of custodial interference and parental alienation. Grace was assigned on May 28th. She was 38, Nigerian, with braids pinned up and a notebook she wrote in with a pencil she kept sharpening to a point. She came to the house on Maple Court on June 3rd, and she sat with Lily in the living room while I made tea in the kitchen, and I could hear them through the doorway. Grace's voice, low and steady, asking Lily about school, about friends, about what she did at Mommy's house and what she did at Daddy's house. And Lily said, "Daddy says Mommy is sick." Grace's pencil stopped. She said, "What do you think, Lily?" Lily said, "I think Mommy is not sick." She said, "Mommy makes me pancakes on Saturday, and she helps me with my spelling, and she reads me stories, and she's not sick." Grace wrote that down. She wrote it down with the pencil sharpened to a point, and the letters were small and precise, and I stood in the kitchen with the tea kettle screaming, and I thought, there it is. There's the sentence that saves my daughter. Grace interviewed Marcus on June 5th. I don't know what he said. I know what Grace wrote in her report because Elise showed me the report on June 7th, the day before the wedding. Grace wrote, "The father exhibits a pattern of coaching the child to repeat negative statements about the mother. The child, when separated from the father, does not spontaneously repeat these statements and demonstrates a secure, affectionate attachment to the mother. The father's demeanor during the interview was controlled and performative. When asked directly about the mother's mental health, he responded with rehearsed language that did not match the natural flow of the conversation. The evaluator recommends maintaining the mother's custody and instituting supervised visitation for the father pending further evaluation." Elise also had the therapist letter, not the forged one. Marcus hadn't produced it yet, and he wouldn't until after the wedding. But a letter from my actual doctor, Dr. Pham at St. Anne's Family Practice, stating that I had no history of anxiety or depression, that I had never been prescribed psychiatric medication, and that my last 3 annual physicals had been unremarkable. Elise had also contacted the therapist whose letterhead Marcus had used in the first life, Dr. Ellen Voss, retired, living in Florida, and obtained a notarized statement confirming that she had never treated me, had never written a letter about me, and had not practiced since 2022. June 8th, the wedding, Edenbrook Country Club. The ballroom smelled like gardenias, Delia's flowers, white gardenias and sage, the same smell, the same heavy sweetness. And I walked in wearing the brick red dress, and I sat in the back row, 12 feet from the exit, 3 feet from Grace Okonkwo, who was attending as an observer at Elise's request, and who had her phone on the table with the recorder running. The room was warm. The string quartet was playing. 140 people. Delia was at the front in white. Tom was at the front in gray. Marcus was at table 4, near the bar, with a glass of champagne he hadn't touched. He was wearing a navy suit. He looked calm. He looked like a man who'd rehearsed something. The toast happened at 8:45 p.m. Tom's best man spoke. Delia's father spoke. Then Marcus stood up. He wasn't on the program. He tapped his glass with a fork. The room went quiet. I felt my stomach drop, the same vertigo. But this time my hands were on the armrest, and the armrest was solid, and Grace's phone was 3 feet away and recording, and I breathed. In through the nose, the gardenias. Out through the mouth. Marcus said, "I want to say something about family." He said family is the most important thing. He said he'd learned that the hard way. He said his ex-wife, and he looked at me, directly at me, and the room followed his eyes. His ex-wife had been struggling. She'd been unstable. She'd been having emotional outbursts. He was worried about their daughter. He'd been trying to get Claire help, but she'd refused. He was asking the family tonight, as a family, to support Claire because she needed support, and to support him because he was trying to protect Lily. It was the same speech, word for word, the same cadence, the same concerned voice, the same performance. I sat in the back row, and I listened, and I didn't stand up. I didn't crack. I breathed, and I felt the armrest under my fingers, and I looked at Grace, and Grace looked at me. And Grace's pencil was moving across her notebook, and the phone was recording, and the room was looking at me, and I didn't move. I sat there, and I let the silence do what my voice couldn't. The silence was louder than the speech. The silence was 140 people waiting for the unstable woman to stand up and crack, and she didn't stand up, and she didn't crack, and the silence stretched, and Marcus's smile tightened, and the room began to understand that something was wrong, not with the woman in the back row, but with the man at the front. I stood up. I didn't stand up fast. I stood up the way you stand up when you're calm, when you've had 20 days to prepare for this exact moment, when you've died on a basement floor and come back and changed the locks and changed the bulb and found a lawyer and found a social worker and found the $312,000, and you are not anymore the person who cracks. I stood up and I said, "Marcus, I'd like to respond." The room was very quiet. Marcus's face was still doing the calm. The calm was working hard. I could see it working, the way you can see a machine working when you know where the gears are. I said, "Marcus has been telling people I'm unstable. He told this room, tonight, that I'm unstable. I'm not going to respond to that with emotion. I'm going to respond with facts." I said, 3 weeks ago, I discovered that Marcus has been embezzling from his family's company $312,847 over 26 months, routed through 3 shell companies, Meridian Supply, Lakeside Materials, Allegheny Fasteners, all registered to Nadine Whitmer, who is Marcus's girlfriend. I have the business registrations. I have the bank records. His father, Robert Halloway, filed a police report on May 30th. Marcus was removed from the company on June 1st. He is currently under criminal investigation for embezzlement and fraud. The room was silent. A glass was set down somewhere near the bar, a small sound, a clink, the kind of sound that happens in a room where no one is talking. Marcus's jaw tightened. The same tightening I'd seen when he heard the will in the first life. No, that was a different life. That was someone else. The tightening of a man hearing a number he doesn't like. I said Marcus has also been coaching our 6-year-old daughter to repeat negative statements about me. A court-appointed custody evaluator interviewed Lily on June 3rd and documented the pattern. The evaluator's report, which was filed with the family court yesterday, recommends maintaining my custody and instituting supervised visitation for Marcus. I said, "Marcus told this room that I've been treated for anxiety and depression. I have never been treated for anxiety or depression. My physician, Dr. Pham at St. Anne's, has provided a letter confirming I have no psychiatric history. In his previous court filing, which hasn't been filed yet, but which his lawyer has drafted, and which I know about because I know how Marcus operates, he plans to present a letter from a therapist named Dr. Ellen Voss. Dr. Voss retired in 2022. She has never treated me. She has provided a notarized statement confirming this. Any letter bearing her letterhead will be a forgery." I looked at Marcus. The calm was gone. The face was doing something I'd never seen. Not the tightening, not the stillness, something raw, something underneath. The face of a man whose machine has been taken apart in front of the people he was performing for. I said, "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm not emotional. I am emotional. My daughter was taken from me by a man who rehearsed a speech for 3 weeks and delivered it at a wedding because he knew I'd react, and he knew he could record it, and he knew he could use it. I reacted, I cracked, he recorded it, he used it. That was the first time, this is the second time. And this time I'm not cracking, and the only person being recorded is him." I sat down. The room was still. Grace's phone was still recording. Delia, at the front of the room in her white dress, was looking at Marcus with an expression I'd never seen on her face. Not anger, not shock, something colder. The face of a woman realizing that her wedding had been used as a weapon. Tom was beside her, and his face was doing something else. The face of a man who'd invited his college friend to his wedding, and was now understanding what his college friend actually was. Marcus left. He didn't say anything. He set his glass on the table, the champagne he hadn't touched, and he walked out of the ballroom. The door closed behind him. The string quartet didn't play. 140 people sat in a room that smelled like gardenias, and nobody moved for a long time. The custody hearing was June 12th. Elise presented Grace Okonkwo's evaluation. She presented Dr. Pham's letter. She presented Dr. Voss's notarized statement. She presented the embezzlement evidence, the business registrations, the bank records, Robert Halloway's forensic accountant's report, the police report. She presented the recording of Marcus's wedding speech. She presented Grace's notes from the wedding, the social worker's contemporaneous observation of Marcus's rehearsed performance, and my measured response. Marcus's lawyer had the forged therapist letter. He tried to introduce it. Elise introduced Dr. Voss's statement first. The letter was never admitted. The judge, not Harrison this time, Harrison had recused himself. The new judge was a woman named Okafor who read every document, looked at Marcus, and said the court finds a pattern of evidence fabrication, parental alienation, and custodial interference. Primary physical custody was awarded to me. Marcus was granted supervised visitation, 2 hours per week at a court-approved facility with a social worker present. The existing custody agreement was vacated. The forged therapist letter was referred to the district attorney's office for investigation of forgery and fraud. Marcus was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and forgery in August. The embezzlement case was straightforward. The forensic accountant's report, the shell company registrations, the bank transfers to Nadine's accounts. Marcus's lawyer argued that the shell companies were legitimate business entities. The jury didn't buy it. The P.O. boxes were at a mail depot. The companies had no employees, no inventory, no websites, no phone numbers. They existed on paper and on deposit slips and nowhere else. Nadine testified against Marcus in exchange for reduced charges. She said he'd come up with the scheme in year 2 of the marriage. She said he'd told her the company would never notice. She said he'd used the money to fund the divorce, the custody lawyer, and the apartment where Lily stayed on his weeks, the apartment paid for with money stolen from his father's company. Marcus was sentenced to 4 years for embezzlement and 18 months for forgery to run consecutively. 5.5 years. In the courtroom after the verdict, he turned to look at me. I was in the second row. Elise was beside me. Grace was behind me. Lily was not there. She was at school, at Pinewood Elementary in Mrs. O'Keefe's first grade class, where she was supposed to be, where she would be every weekday morning at 8:15 a.m., because she was mine and she was staying mine and no one was going to take her to an apartment paid for with stolen money and tell her that her mother was sick. Marcus looked at me, and his face was doing the thing, the stillness, the calculation. But the numbers weren't working anymore, and the machine was broken, and he knew it, and I knew it, and I looked back at him, and I didn't feel the staircase. I felt the floor, solid, warm, mine. I drove home after the sentencing. Maple Court. The geraniums were on the windowsill, red, drought-resistant, the kind Marcus had brought my mother on our 3rd date, the kind she'd been watering ever since, the kind that bloomed every summer regardless of what happened in the house behind them. I sat in the driveway for a while. Lily's backpack was on the passenger seat. She'd dropped it there when I'd picked her up from school. It was pink. It had a sticker on it that said, "Be bold." It weighed 4 pounds, which is what a first grader's backpack weighs when it's full of library books and a lunchbox and a crayon drawing of a dog that looks nothing like a dog. I picked it up and I held it, and it was warm from the sun, and it smelled like crayons and apple juice and the specific, unrepeatable smell of my daughter. And I pressed it against my chest and I breathed. I went inside. I changed the back staircase bulb. I'd been changing it every week since May, even though it hadn't burned out, because the act of changing it was the act of remembering. And I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember the dark and the cold and the sound of the lock turning and the wine on the floor. Not because I wanted to suffer, because the remembering was the lock, the remembering was the deadbolt on the door, the remembering was the thing that kept me from ever being the person who didn't change the bulb again. Lily came home at 3:30. She ran to me, not walked, ran. The backpack bounced on her shoulders and her shoes were untied, and she grabbed my index finger. The same finger, the same grip, the grip that had never loosened, that had held on through every week and every Wednesday dinner, and every night I'd spent in a house that smelled like lemon cleaner and coffee and the memory of gardenias. And she said, "Mommy, I drew you a dog," and I said, "It's beautiful." And she said, "It doesn't look like a dog," and I said, "It looks exactly like a dog." And she laughed, and the laugh was the sound of safe. And I held her hand, and I didn't let go. The first time I died at the bottom of a staircase with a cracked skull and a bottle of wine poured on the floor to make it look like an accident. The second time, I changed the bulb and installed the lock and found the lawyer and found the evidence and let the man who killed me deliver the same speech in the same room to the same audience. And this time, the speech was the evidence, and the audience was the jury, and the performance was the confession. Trust isn't weakness. But trusting someone who's already shown you who they are, that's not trust. That's surrender wearing a wedding ring. And the thing about second chances is they don't come with instructions. They come with the memory of cold concrete and the sound of a lock turning and the knowledge that the person who handed you the wine is not the person you married. Some bulbs aren't meant to stay unchanged. Some locks aren't meant to be opened from the outside. Some stairs aren't meant to be walked down in the dark. Not by you, not anymore. If this story reminded you of a time someone you loved turned a family gathering into a weapon, or a time you were too tired to see the shape of what was happening, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want to hear what happens when the quiet ones finally stop being quiet, subscribe. There's always another story.